G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give the American Nightmare series a big shout out for sponsoring this episode. So I want to talk to you guys about one of my favorite true crime podcasts. It's called American Nightmare: Murder in a Safe Place, and it investigates the vicious rape and murder of 50-year-old nurse Sherry Crandell inside the DC area hospital where she worked. Her murder has mystified not only the police, but her family and the community for the past 2 decades. Police have DNA evidence and fingerprints, even a witness to the attack, but no suspect yet. With the help of modern DNA testing and tips from listeners of Murder in a Safe Place, the police are closer than ever to solving the murder. Researched and reported by award-winning DC journalist Paul Wagner, hear the story unfold and join in the search to find Sherry Crandell's vicious killer. Are you looking for your latest binge? Well, you just found it. Check out the American Nightmare series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. When I was 9, my parents bought a derelict or abandoned farm deep in the woods of Sweden. This wasn't the first time my parents had done this either. My parents had just sold the first farm after they made the farm livable, and I must admit that I was sad to part with it, but I did look forward to a whole new world of adventure and discoveries on the new one. Nothing spooky ever really happened on the first farm. I was never really scared of the old house or the woods around it. I could be alone for hours in the woods, in fact, just playing and making dens for picnics with my imaginary adventure team and all that sort of stuff. But something changed, though, when we bought the second farm. The first couple of times we came to paint and build on the house, nothing ever happened. I was just exploring the different buildings in the woods around us. This farm had like 4 buildings: the main house, a garage, a stable, and we never found out where the 4th building was. It was badly damaged after it had been burned down or something. But at the time I was really into horses, and I was always in the stables. And I think that we had owned the house for about a year when the first thing happened. So I was playing in the stable, just with some hay, when I suddenly felt like someone had their hands around my neck and squeezed. I couldn't breathe, and I instantly ran out of the stable, and as soon as I saw my mum, I could breathe again, but I was coughing and wheezing, and I just couldn't stop. I tried to explain what was happening, but my throat hurt so much that I just kept coughing. My mum rushed me inside the house and got me some water. I was still coughing and gasping after 15 minutes, so my mum decided to drive me to the hospital while my dad stayed with my brothers. I eventually stopped coughing, of course, and nobody could really understand what happened. Just for your information too, before the next part, up until I was 14, I never had any allergies, and I had my first asthma attack when I was like 13. The reason I mention this is because the next episode was written off as just an asthma attack. Looking back and now knowing what an actual asthma attack felt like, I just call bullcrap on this one. But anyway, after that whole thing, I stopped playing in the stable and I opted for playing in the woods with my brothers. And the next thing that happened was when I was about 11. I had woken up in the middle of the night to hear somebody walking around. I stood up from my bed and walked past my parents, who were sleeping in the same room. I went to the kitchen and I saw a black figure just standing in the middle of the kitchen. Had I not looked closely, I probably would have just walked by it thinking that it was my dad. But I sort of just froze because something came over me and I turned around and walked straight back to my bed. I couldn't sleep though, and to be honest, I felt like somebody was staring at me all night. I told my parents the next day that I saw a man in the kitchen, but they told me that I was probably just dreaming. I probably was dreaming, but after seeing that figure, I always felt like I just wasn't welcome and always felt eyes on me at all times. One occurrence, though, left me just terrified of this house, and I begged my parents to leave me with my grandparents whenever they went to the farm after this. So one day, I was just on my computer chatting with some online friends and playing a game. My parents wanted to go grocery shopping and asked if I wanted to come too. I declined, being really into my game at the time, and they asked me if I was sure, but I nodded and they left me with my brothers. And immediately I regretted not going as soon as that door slammed shut because a feeling of just terror overcame me. I was scanning the whole room that I was in, scared to find something that I shouldn't have. The car had already pulled onto the dirt road and out of sight by now. The sound of the car drifted away and I was left in terror and just in silence. The silence somehow grew louder and louder until it was deafening, and all of a sudden I felt a pop in my ears. I was shaking and my teeth were chattering. I was so scared. But then I heard a tap, and then another one and another one. The taps were in a predictable rhythm, and I knew it was at least 2 hours until my family came home, since the grocery store was miles away, and I had to endure it, but something sent me running out of the house. Because in the doorway to the kitchen, I saw a figure sort of stalking towards me. This time, I knew that it wasn't a dream too. My lungs felt like they were being crushed, and I began getting an instant headache. I stared at the figure for a good 5 seconds, then, in pure shock, I sprinted out of the back door and towards the dirt road. I was thankful that I was still wearing my flip-flops after eating breakfast outside, and I ran up the dirt road aiming to get help from the neighbours who lived about a 20-minute walk away. I didn't expect to see our car come down the road, but I walked to the side of the road and my parents hopped out and asked what happened. I burst out crying, and so they put me in the car. I refused to go inside the house again, but my parents thought that I just made it all up, and they told me that I was paranoid. But I stand by what I saw, and years later I still hate that farm. I've only visited once since after that, but never again, because whatever is on that farm specifically hates me. I just have one thing, though, that has been bothering me a lot. How long was I frozen in place? Because, like I said, it takes hours for us to go grocery shopping, and it felt like what happened was in the span of maybe 5 or 10 minutes. To be honest, though, I don't even know if I want to know. I'm just happy that I don't ever have to go back there again. I, a 23-year-old female, grew up in a rural area in Ontario. It was the kind of place where you never really lock your doors because, well, you know everyone in town. The all-too-trusting small-town mentality stayed with me once I moved to a big city for university. I got an apartment in a student area with a college nearby and plenty of bars within walking distance. I lived with a guy friend, Roddy, who was a few years older than me from the same small town. I would go to the bar with friends on the weekends and stumble home by myself around 2 a.m. One night, on my way home, my neighbour Kyle and I met in the hallway, both headed to our own places. He was also drunk and so good-looking. He said hello and invited me inside, and I ended up staying the night with him. He was nice, and it was a fun night, if not a little bit awkward. We didn't exchange numbers, and it didn't seem like he cared for anything to come of it, so I went home in the morning, and that was that. Fast forward to 2 days later, though. I was asleep in my bed, and my roommate was half asleep on the couch with the TV on, and he heard a sound that might have been the door creaking open, but he ignored it in his tired state. A few minutes later, he opened his eyes to see a naked man standing in front of him, lifeless and staring into his eyes. It was Kyle. Roddy tried to talk to him and ask him what the heck he was doing here, but he didn't respond. Roddy ran to my room and said, I think Kyle is here to see you. So I followed him out into the living room and saw a completely naked Kyle staring at us with the most serious and concentrated eyes that I had ever seen. I tried to talk to him and ask him to leave, but once again he just didn't respond. Instead, he went into our kitchen and opened the fridge. He proceeded to take our butter out and started smearing it all over his face and chest, saying nothing, and still with a completely serious look on his face. Roddy and I just ran to my bedroom to talk about what to do. While we were in the room, Kyle walked down the dark hallway that led to us and stood in the dark right before the light of my room could reach him. All you could do was see his silhouette, and he started whispering just my name over and over again, repeatedly. Roddy and I ended up calling the police and staying in my room until they came and took him back to his house. They said that he must have been on drugs, but probably wasn't a threat. I agreed too, and I didn't think that he was a threat, but I didn't sleep well that night knowing that he was a thin wall away from us in this apartment. I should add here as well that I talked to Kyle about a week later, and he had no memory of doing this, but he did call 911 on himself and got an ambulance to the hospital the next morning because he had severe sunstroke, so it was likely sunstroke-induced delirium or something. He's okay now, thankfully, but anyway, that was probably the cause of that. But we forgot to lock our doors another time. I was at work and Roddy was at home. I got a text from him that said, "Please get home. Someone is here and I think you must know them because I don't." So I took an early lunch and came home to see what was going on. There was a man with greasy black hair so long that it nearly reached his elbows. He was pacing back and forth in our living room, and before I even got a chance to speak to him, I realized that he was definitely not mentally present. He would alternate between screaming at the top of his lungs like he was being murdered, and then he would cry and say things like, "I can feel the pain and suffering of everyone in the world. I can hear the voices of the poor and the tormented in my brain begging me to help them. I can't stand this suffering. Nobody understands my powers and ability to know what everyone is thinking." I would chime in to politely ask, "Do you know where you are, or what is your address? I can help you get home." And then he would scream at us because this was his house and he wasn't leaving. He wanted us to stop judging him. After about 10 minutes of him rambling and pacing, he finally said his address to us, which was actually the neighboring apartment where Kyle lived. I knew Kyle had a roommate that I met, John, but apparently this was their third roommate. I went to his door and knocked, and thankfully, the roommate John opened the door and came to retrieve the rambling man. Later that night, John knocked on our door, and I opened it to see him holding a bottle of wine. He wanted to thank us for handling the situation well and making sure that he got home. Apparently, the man had recently been in a mental hospital and left on his own accord and walked into the wrong apartment. His parents came and got him, and he's back in hospital now, safe and sound, thankfully. But to have two people from the same apartment do such strange things, just by coming over randomly and acting so bizarre, it certainly got me worried. I'll start by saying I have a terrible biological father. He's been a shady person all my life and constantly caused me a lot of grief. This is just one of those examples. When I was 4, my parents split up. My mother and I moved states and they agreed that I would visit my dad every school holidays for a week. But this one particular time, I'd been with him for a few days when I was playing with my cousin at a nearby park. A car pulled up and I recognized the man as one of my dad's friends. He called me over and, without thinking, I ran over and left my cousin at the park. He asked me if I could show him where my dad lived, and I agreed and got in his car. I gave directions and didn't notice at all that they weren't following them correctly. Looking back, I didn't really know the way anyhow. After way too long, I did realize that we were getting closer to the city, which is far from my dad's house. We pulled up at a house I didn't recognize, and the man told me to wait in his car. I did. I didn't feel scared at all for some reason. He eventually took me inside, and I definitely started to feel unsafe then. I mainly remember 2 girls passed out with their tops off, and a much older man was feeling them up everywhere. I made eye contact with this man, and he made me sick to my stomach. I had definitely figured out that this was a bad situation by this point. A lady took me into her bedroom and brought me a sandwich. The bread was stale and I wasn't hungry, but I ate it all because I felt bad for her, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's what I was thinking about. The lady told me a lot of things I didn't understand, but when she left, I remember thinking my dad was coming to pick me up soon. I fell asleep waiting for him. I went to bed that night, and no one came to see me the next day until I cried very loudly and banged on the door. The lady came back and yelled at me for stinking up her bedroom, and I asked about my dad. She said that he was coming tonight after he finished work. She didn't offer me a shower or a bath, so I sat in my soiled pants all day. After that, everything turned into just a blur, really. My dad didn't come that night, and I was really terrified, obviously. In my head, I felt like I was there for months. I thought that I was missing school and everyone had forgotten about me. In reality, I was there for like 5 days, and they let me take one shower. I don't remember eating much except for boring sandwiches, and I had chips and gravy once. But finally, though, my mum drove across the country to come and get me. After not being able to get a hold of me or my dad for so long, and then me missing my pre-booked flight home, she panicked and came looking for me. And thank God that she did. She found my dad at his girlfriend's house, methed out completely, hiding out. It turns out he owed a lot of drug money to the people who had taken me. They had told him that they had me, but he couldn't afford it, or didn't want me back, whatever it was. The point is that he didn't bother to try and get me back. My amazing mum paid his debt for him after borrowing from a lot of people, and she came to get me back. I remember when someone came into that room and told me that my mum was here, and I walked out and I could smell her. It was the best feeling to feel safe again like that, and she took me home, and I didn't see my dad again for a long time after that. She never called the police. My parents' relationship was very complicated back then, and I fully understand the choices that she made. I'm definitely okay now. I've spoken about this in therapy, and I've come to terms with most of the things that I went through as a child. But still, it's a messed up situation for a 4-year-old girl to have to be in, right? Anyway, I'm grateful that I got out of there pretty much unscathed, and I'm thankful for my mum. So, let me get a couple of things straight. Our little village was the kind of place where everybody knows everyone, and I could count the amount of houses on 2 hands. We were a really quiet and close-knit community, and nothing ever really happened there. A proper out-in-the-sticks sort of stuff. But one night, a few years ago, my mum and my stepdad had gone out to this concert and left me in charge of my little brother and the dog. I wasn't very old, about 14, but I felt really proud that my parents trusted me enough to do that. I thought that I was a pretty cool big brother, and I thought that we'd be doing cool babysitter stuff like staying up late, eating pizza, etc. And I'm kind of glad that we did, because I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't. At about 10:30, the power cut out. I didn't think anything about it at first, because the weather hadn't been great lately, and I figured that had something to do with it. I got some candles out of the cupboard, and I lit them and put some of my favorite songs on. As soon as I sat back down, Sonny, my little brother, turned to me and, being the weird little kid that he was, told me very calmly that somebody was apparently outside. I was a little perturbed by him, but the dog hadn't done anything, so I presumed it was just the neighbors or something. He just shrugged and went back to his drawings. There's a bit of a running joke in our house that you don't actually need a clock with the dog around, because he's such a creature of habit that he will constantly get up at exactly the same time every night to tell you that it's time to initiate his nightly go-to-bed protocol. And it was about 3/4 of an hour after the power went out when my dog decided that now was that time. I told Sonny to go get the dog his biscuit while I let him out for a pee. Now, our kitchen is an extension to the original house, and so, as such, has a flat roof that's comparatively low to the ground, compared to the rest of the house that is, and offers easy access to the bathroom window. As I open the door so the dog could do its thing, Sonny pushes past me in the doorway and whispers, "I know you're out there and I'm calling the police," as he turned around with the biggest, proudest smile you'd ever seen on his face. There was a very distinct rustling coming from just above the doorway. I don't think I'll ever forget the way Sonny's face dropped when he looked just above my head. I looked up. The man sitting on the roof above me panicked, tried to kick me, and then ran off into the next-door neighbor's garden, and presumably into the cornfield surrounding our village. I was obviously scared to the bone, and Sonny was bawling his eyes out. I ushered him inside as quickly as I could, and I got a knife from the kitchen. We both went to his room, and I told him to try and get some sleep while I waited for our parents to come back. It was an agonizingly long 4 hours before they did. My stepdad immediately went outside to check to see if everything was all right. I heard them talking about how something had smashed the fuse box. Obviously, we then called the police, but they didn't come until later that day. They did a search of the immediate premises, and they actually found a makeshift bed in a nearby disused barn, along with pictures of silhouettes of us in the shower through the frosted glass window. I think it's pretty safe to say that the whole experience definitely shook us up. We moved out as soon as we could, but I still shut curtains wherever I go, and I see shadows underneath every door that I see. I think that it's affected me long term. Sonny keeps quiet about it, but I'm not sure if that's just because his brain has cut it out, or what. Ever since I can remember, there's this kind of energy around my dad's house. The feeling of being watched or not being alone is a regular one. Everyone who lives there can feel it, but have learned to somehow accept or at least ignore it. There are tons of stories from guests and households, including closing doors, objects moving, and strange noises. I compiled 3 personal stories to share with you, and this is what happened. So when I was 13, my grandfather died, unfortunately, and in the following months, once a day, I felt as if somebody entered my room, checked everything around, and just sort of left. It's difficult to explain, but I always told myself it was my granddad just making sure I was alright, and it gave me some peace of mind. That was the only really good paranormal experience I've had here, and everything else has been, well, a lot more creepy. Now, I know it's not a story per se, but I would like to mention that I've had sleep paralysis here. I'd been in this house and in my already deceased grandfather's bedroom for some time at that point. But fast forward to when I was 21 and I visited my dad and stayed in the guest room since my old room was turned into a studio. This room has the bed against the wall that separates it from the hall, so I could hear everything that happened there. Sometime in the middle of the night, I started hearing noises like some kind of heavy furniture being moved. I scratched it up to just being house noises though, but then it got a bit worse. Steps could be heard in the hall, and besides me, the only person in the house was my dad, whose bedroom was next and in the opposite direction from the sound the footsteps were coming from. The next thing I heard was the door handle moving frantically up and down as if someone was trying to open the door, and as soon as I turned the lights on, the movement stopped. Now that I was sure that I wasn't imagining it, I locked the door and went back to bed with the lights still on. And not even 2 minutes later, the door handle started to rattle again, but even more violently this time. I could see the metal plaques that held it together being separated from the door itself, and that's when I started to scream for my dad. It took me a good minute to open the door for him when he got there, and I'm not ashamed to say that I took my mattress to his room and I slept there that night. In the morning, my dad and I checked the door handle and the screws, and they had actually been loosened from all the rattling. A couple of days later, I called my grandmother, who also lives at the house but was away on a trip, to tell her what had happened. Turns out that she had experienced the same thing in the same bedroom months before. Needless to say, I never slept alone when I visited the following years, and I always slept and stayed with my grandma in her room. Back when I was in the 3rd grade, there was a hill with a playground at the top. One day, while everybody was playing at the park, as it was recess, this middle-aged man wearing nothing but cargo shorts came to the bottom of the hill and leaned over a fence that was there. He then began to call the kids over to him, and when the kids came over, he wrapped them up in blue tape, mainly around their hands. This went on for about 15 minutes when the 4th grade science teacher, the saint that she is, began to run down the guy. Now, this woman can be very intimidating when she wants to be. She later became the principal, in fact. But anyway, the second this guy saw her, he walked away. He obviously didn't care about getting caught, but the whole situation was a weird one, and when I reflect back on it, it seems obvious that this guy was trying to kidnap a whole bunch of kids. This may be a bit of a ramble of thoughts, but after recently stumbling upon this place, I finally felt like I'd found a place where I could offer something that my family and I experienced a few years ago that, to this day, gives me the creeps. I've been camping, solo backpacking, and hunting my whole life in Oregon, and felt comfortable in the woods and have a deep respect for nature. A few years ago, my wife and daughter and 2 German Shepherds went camping north of Mount Jefferson, Oregon. I have included the coordinates of our campsite, which we found to be the perfect setup for us, and our 2 dogs too, who need the privacy since they're pretty intimidating to other dog owners and can be loud when spooked. It was not an established campsite, just a nice horseshoe off of a USFS road that had flat ground full trees and a fire pit. The first night, my daughter wanted to sleep by herself in a 2-man tent right next to ours. It was maybe 2 feet away, I would guess, from me and my wife's tent. We made the male German Shepherd, Guts is his name, sleep with her in the tent. That whole first night, neither my wife or I could sleep for some reason, because we both could have sworn that we heard footsteps, and they were heavy, not like typical forest critters scampering around in the night. I was well armed because I was paranoid from reading recently before departing about a dad in California who was shot and killed in a tent next to his 2 infant daughters. Needless to say, both my wife and I had 2 pistols and my rifle with me. The dogs are great at detection, and that's why I felt my daughter could sleep alone, because Guts is completely fearless, and nothing would lay a hand on her without a battle to the death. But all in all, nothing but bad vibes and loud footsteps occurred that night, which I ultimately decided was deer or maybe some sort of an elk. Day 2, morning, we go for a walk down the road and maybe 300 feet away see the circle area in the photo. I see an abandoned road where a rusted gatepost, a gate was missing, was covered in vegetation. Something of blue color caught my eye, and Guts immediately takes off running down this abandoned road. My heart begins to race because I think it's another family camping like us, and he's going to get himself shot or scare some innocent people to death, so I chase after him as fast as I can, and the rest follow. He stops after 20 feet into the road, and me yelling his name, but I've covered just enough distance to see that there's nobody there, and something is really off about this site. I yell out, "Hello? Is anyone there? Sorry about the dog." I got no response. My curiosity gets the best of me, and I have to see what the site conditions were. As I got closer, I know something is wrong, though. It had all the necessities for a campsite, including a cooler, propane burner, tent, blankets, folding table, but every single item had been just completely destroyed, smashed and torn from what appeared to be claw marks. We all walked around in circles, puzzled why anyone would leave all their camping gear behind, including an expensive REI tent. I figured, well, someone left in a hurry and animals got to the rest as the only logical explanation. Still, a propane tank and cooler were flattened by something. It certainly wasn't snowpack with tree coverage in that spot. As the afternoon rolls in and me and my daughter are playing ball at the campsite, and my wife goes walking maybe 70 feet north to do her business, I don't have a direct line of sight on her, but all of a sudden I see Guts make a mad dash straight towards her. Normally he would always be with me unless he's called over, and she didn't call for him. His speed and focus caught my attention though, and I knew immediately that something weird was going on, so I ran over there and my wife starts jogging at me, and I immediately draw my pistol. Guts has completely continued running in the forest another 100 feet before I call him and he stopped. My other dog, Leah, who never misses the opportunity to be the pack leader, is not taking point. I've had her for 7 years, and this was the first time in her life, honestly, that she refused to leave my daughter's side. She was full hair raised, though, and also attached to us at the hip. Again, any time that we hike or play, Leah is up front, bossing everyone in her path, and pauses to look to see where we were and continues. I asked my wife what happened, and she said, I was trying to pee, and all of a sudden I just felt all my hairs raise, and I just knew that somebody was watching me. And then I saw Guts running towards me, and I just got up to move towards you. We spent 10 minutes looking for signs of anything, but saw no trails. No broken branches, nothing to point to what and where something went. So we just decided that we're spending one more night since it's too late to pack up and drive, but we'll all be in the big tent together tonight. Before we go to bed, though, I put a rope with a makeshift coin alarm around the perimeter of our campsite. I actually used a mint can and some coins and keys from our truck, and zip-tied it so anything hitting the rope gave a little jingle. Very unsophisticated, but it put my wife at ease. As I go to tie my last corner off at the tree near our tent, our third mystery item unveils itself, because it looks like someone has done the same exact thing that I've done with a rope that was so old and brown that I didn't see it at first. It was broken and only had a few pieces remaining, but sure enough it was tied at roughly the same height, 8 to 10 inches off the ground, and even had a few rusted washers on it. I immediately felt like somebody had stayed here before and put the same makeshift warning system on the same tree that I had maybe 10 or 15 years ago, based on the condition of the rope. Perhaps my paranoia has now reached a new height, but I had to make sure the girls felt that we were safe, and at the time, the only thing that I could think of was when the evening came around. I made them sit in the truck, and I fired a clip of my .45 into the dirt as a signal to whatever was out there that we were armed. I reassured the girls that anybody listening to that now knows that we have 2 wolves and are armed, and we're too risky of a target so we can sleep safely. That night, we heard no footsteps, and the dogs never perked up and barked. We left early the next morning. But fast forward to today, and I watched the Amazon Missing 411 Hunted documentary, and I noticed the cluster smack dab close to where we actually camped that weekend. And it was at this point that a flood of dread rushes over me as I think of that mysterious abandoned campsite with the ripped tent and the smashed cooler and the cook-up. We've been camping since then and have enjoyed the beauty of NW many times, but there was something there at that place that possibly took or harmed somebody else less than 300 feet away from where we camped, and we all thank our lucky stars that Guts was doing his thing so well that afternoon. So I'm a very, very active skater, and I often go out to street spots to try and skate them. A lot of the time, I meet some less than unsavory people, but this time, it just took the cake. So it's around 6:30 p.m., perfect day for skating, and I'm just getting a spot around a public park called Rosa Park Circle. I was doing my thing when this tall man came up to me and told me that I was doing a good job. The creepy man said that his name was Jay, and I said that my name was Satan, trying to be a jackass. He said, "Hey, you're doing a really good job." "Oh, thanks. I've been working on my skating for a while now, and I think I'm doing a really good job recently. I tend to trust people too much." "Yeah, I can see that. My name's Jay. I'm 55 years old and I'm bi." At this point, I kind of knew what was coming. I'm pretty good at detecting people's implications, thankfully. Throughout this entire conversation, he kept mentioning his sexuality, and I tried my absolute best to just try and get out of the conversation when I could. I was trying to do a few tricks down a small ledge. The guy was just staring at me while I was doing it, and I must admit that it felt really uncomfortable. He pulled me aside one more time, and this is what he said. "Listen, I really like you. I know you're only 15, but as long as you consent, we can still hook up, okay?" No, we can't. I'm only 14, and the consent age is 16. Plus, I'm not really comfortable with the things that you're saying, and I need to go home anyways. It was nice meeting you, but I need to go. Okay, but remember not to tell anybody, okay? This happened today, and obviously I told my parents. After they get off the phone with my sister, they're going to be making a police report about this man. I was pretty livid on my way home, and it didn't help that my entire playlist on YouTube is full of hard rock. So in other words, I was kind of steaming when I got home. I did go back to skate there again as well, and wouldn't you know it, he told me that we were such good friends and that he was drunk and that he was really sorry and all that. But I just skated past and looped around and took a picture. I think he was still drunk because he straight up rattled off his name. But thankfully, me and my mum were on the phone with a detective recently, and they're apparently going to follow it up. I was 18 years old and worked in a mall clothing store. I usually worked the night shift, which meant leaving the store between 9 or 9:30 p.m. None of us really thought anything about calling out goodnight and walking out to our cars alone. Usually the parking lot was full of all the other workers leaving at the same time anyway. But on this particular night, I was in a great mood. I'd had a good evening at work and was going to meet up with my boyfriend when I got home, so I was just smiling and thinking to myself as I walked. When I got to the curb in front of the mall exit door to check for oncoming cars before I crossed over to where my car was parked, and it wasn't that far away, maybe 10 spaces from the front, I glanced up to verify where my car was, and I caught the eyes of a man sitting in his truck. He was wearing a cowboy hat pulled down lower over his eyes as though trying to conceal his face, but he was staring intently right at me. Of that much I was sure. I literally froze in place. I've never felt fear like I did in that moment. I snapped out of my trance, though, and I ran as fast as I could past his truck into my car, which was only a few spaces away. This was before key fobs, so I needed my keys to unlock the door. I always made fun of scary movies when the girl ran and sort of dropped the keys trying to get in, but it really does happen that way sometimes. I was shaking so badly that I couldn't even get the key in the door, and then I dropped the damn things. Seconds later, I was sitting in the car and shaking so badly that I just had to sit there a moment or two before I could drive off. He hadn't chased me, he didn't leave, but he did continue to just sit there. Later in the evening, after I had finally calmed down, I felt like an idiot, thinking that I must have gotten scared by somebody's husband picking up his wife after work or something. The next day, I went back to work, same night shift, and told everybody at work what had happened and how scared I had been. I sort of made fun of myself for being such a chicken, but I made sure that somebody walked out with me later that night. I stood at the door of the mall ready to run back in if I saw anything off, but he wasn't there this time. I sort of exhaled, and my friend and I went to our cars, relieved that everything was going to be okay. The following day at work, there was no talk of my fright from 2 nights ago, and it was business as usual pretty much. About halfway into my shift, the manager walked up to me and said that she actually needed to speak with me. She turned around and walked up to the cop that I had not noticed was in the store now. But curiously, I walked over and my manager wanted me to tell the cop about what had happened. I felt silly telling him for some reason because nothing had really happened. But when I finished telling him my story, he started asking questions about the truck. Did I know what model it was, exact color? Did I know the year? I finally said something about how I didn't want to get anyone in trouble, that I just freaked out a little bit and it was no big deal. But then the cop explained that the night before, one of the ladies leaving for the night had actually been kidnapped, driven around to the back of the mall into an unlit area, and was beaten, and, well, you get the rest. I felt myself get lightheaded, and my vision went back for a moment, with it dawning on me that I had actually seen this guy. Her guy was not wearing a cowboy hat. That was the only difference in our descriptions, though. And that was the beginning. Our city now had a serial rapist, and it took them years to finally catch him. In the end, too, it was actually his wife that figured out it was her husband and turned him in. That was a really scary time, too, and the women were terrified to be out alone after dark. At our mall, and I imagine at the others as well, no one was allowed to leave alone. The mall parking lot was now lit up 360, and they had security on site making sure that we were all safe. We also started a chain call between the stores to let one another know if you saw anyone that made you suspicious or frightened, so that everyone would be on guard. I must admit, though, that I've always felt a little bit guilty for that woman being attacked like that. I mean, maybe I could have done something if I had spoken up earlier. So I got back from Iraq not too long ago, and I thought that I would share my experiences. We get into the country, and it's nothing big, just doing our jobs in the desert. Due to the nature of my job or mission, I was confined to the fob. I worked nights the whole tour, so my work hours were 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. As you can imagine, I slept during the day. Now, the base was a premier duty station for the Iraqi military. It was built in the 70s or 80s to accommodate the expanding army under Saddam's rule. So Gulf War 91 happens and we bombed it out. 03 we invade again, and guess what? Bombed out and then occupied until 2011 when given back to the Iraqis. 2014 bombed out again because ISIS took over it and was using it as a death camp. Olympic swim pools on location were full of bodies, and there was a steamroller used for running people over. 2014 now occupied by the Iraqi army. And so, as you can imagine, this could be a hotbed of stuff. So the first occurrence, it was about a month into our tour, and I was dead asleep in my room. We sleep in a 6x6 room with a roommate. I was fortunate enough to never see him since we had opposite shifts. I was racked out with my back to the center of the room, and I woke up to a sort of slight touch or grab to the back of my arm. I rolled over to see that it was a 6'4" looking all-black shadow standing 6 feet from me. I actually wear glasses and my vision is absolutely awful sometimes, so assuming it was one of my soldiers waking me up, I roll back over after putting on my glasses, and when I do, nothing was there. So tripped out, I got a hold of my roommate, and he chalks it up to some bad dream, and so did I. 2 months go by, and business as usual. I go to work at 9, and my roommate settles in. Taking advantage of him being alone, he attempts to masturbate one night too. After finishing, he sits up trying to clean up and head up to the shower, and the ambient light of his headlight lights up my end of the room. He notices something out of the corner of his eye, though, and looks to see what he said was a big-ass guy, big like its feet portion were hanging off our bed. It's like a college dorm-sized twin bed, and apparently it was all black. So pretty much a shadow dude laying on my bed. He said fight or flight hit him, and because he was cleaning off after masturbating, he froze up. After looking away and back again when trying to find the actual light switch, it was gone. So he believed it after that, and thought that it wasn't just a dream. Well, we told our PSG, platoon sergeant, at chow the next day, and he was amused and sort of interested too. He's a believer in the paranormal and decided to speak his part. According to him, at this point in the tour, about 3 months in, he's seen someone leave my room at odd times in the middle of the day, times that I'm sleeping, and walk to the room across from us. The thing about the room across, though, is that it had a padlocked plywood door and was always locked because the guys who slept there were in Syria, so much of the gear that they had to leave behind was still in there. You can't actually get in without hopping the plywood walls. And anyway, that was the extent of the creepy stuff with my living space. I don't know if it was a djinn or whatever you call it, but my interpreter said that it probably was, since it kept getting close to me and manifested physically. If I could describe it, I guess it would look similar to the shadow dude captured on the Ghosts of Carmel, Maine YouTube channel. Not spot on, because I saw the shadow silhouette of a rather jacked and tall person instead of that. But the next occurrence was weird. So I was taking a crap in the porch johns at night, and you'd hear footsteps or whispers around you sometimes. Know too that when you're in there next to the watchtower, that's 150 to 300 meters away from another group of soldiers, it's at 3 a.m., there's nobody awake to mess with you except the other guy in the tower, and he can't actually abandon his watch since he's covering. The third thing that happened was also weird. I attended a sleep aid class with the medics and whatnot since I was having trouble sleeping soundly, and in the group there were soldiers waking up with bad dreams and with scratches on them sometimes, some of which were bad enough that they bled too, and it dried during their sleep though. They only discovered it after they woke up to bloody sheets. Nobody really ever said anything about this though, other than the medics asking if he needs to take a look at it. But the entry point guys who man a big gate with obstacles would also hear commotions like banging on the metal at the main gate at night, and would go to check it out, but nothing would ever come of it. The towers would report people walking in the open area around the perimeter at night. Some would notice something in their night vision or in the darkness that their eyes adjusted to, but when the sergeant on guard or other response elements would check it, there would be nothing there. Perhaps one of the spookier things, though, was a woman screaming was reported from towers in the vicinity of a bombed-out bunker, and also an abandoned, half-destroyed building on the far end of the FOB. SOG responded, and we had no personal report of a rape or an assault or anything. Yes, that happens out there. And nobody came up missing or astray either. The tower didn't report anyone in the area either, other than SOJs and relief around that time. Anyway, there's my spooky experiences from Iraq that some of you guys might be interested in. Feel free to leave some questions in the comment section below, and I'll see if I can get to them. Thanks for listening. I used to deliver pizzas when in college, and I delivered this order to this house, and the guy opened the door and was like, "Honey, the pizza is here." But the house was obviously empty. Like, nothing in this house. No furniture, no rugs, no nothing. Literally just floor and walls. It was a massive place too, and abandoned. No noise whatsoever. But the guy told me to come in while he goes to get his wallet, and he asks me to stand in a very specific spot, and tells me don't move. Then he locks the door, and then he walks to another room to get his wallet, and keeps looking back at me. I'm waiting for like 10 minutes and nothing. I walk towards the corner the guy went to and get close to this door, and I hear the guy talking about me, like physically talking, describing me, and keep saying it'll be easy. And that was when I bolted, found the back door, hopped the fence, and I quit that very day. I never delivered anything ever again after that too, because, well, that was just too much for me. During this time, I was going to grad school in Texas and visiting my family in Kansas City. I had just finished my visit and was driving back to Texas. I'd started my drive, and about an hour in, unfortunately, I got a flat tire. I called my dad, and he told me to call roadside assistance and that he would be there with the AAA card as soon as he could. He got there, roadside assistance put my spare on, and we went off to the nearest Walmart to get my tires replaced. The nearest Walmart was about 20 miles away, as we were in a pretty rural part of Kansas. I was following my dad, driving about 55 miles per hour since I was on a spare. There weren't a lot of cars on the highway, but basically just me and my dad. My dad was actually a little bit ahead of me, so I don't think that it was apparent that I was following him. But somewhere along the drive, I noticed a dark-colored SUV behind me. He was flashing his lights at me, swerving onto the shoulder and then back into his lane, accelerating so that he was really close to my car, and then he would fall back a bit. From the time that I noticed him, he did this for about 4 or 5 miles, which is a really long time when you're in that moment. I was about to call my dad because I felt like this was incredibly strange and very dangerous. Like I said, it was a pretty rural area and there were no cars around. If this guy was upset that I was driving slowly, he could have just gotten into the left lane and passed me, but he continued to flash his lights, tailgate me, and swerve onto the shoulder again. At this point, my dad saw what was happening, took an exit, and parked on the shoulder of the exit. I followed. The exit was not the one that we needed to take. It was a rural exit onto a gravel road, and I don't think it's used very frequently. Lo and behold, the guy followed me as well. I pulled in behind my dad, who was already out of his car with his arms in the air saying, "What the hell?" At this point, I think the guy finally realized that I wasn't truly alone. He slowed down a bit, looked at both of us, and hesitated for a second, and then he just took a hard left onto the gravel road and took off. At this point, I thought about trying to get his license plate, but it was a bit too late for that. The dust from the gravel road made it pretty much impossible to see his license plate anyway. I still kind of kicked myself for not looking at his license plate sooner. But anyway, it was a situation that just really frightened me. We did call the police to report it, but there really wasn't much that they could do since, well, we didn't have any license plate number or any identification. However, I did learn that if I'm ever in this situation again, that I should call Highway Patrol and not 911. Apparently, when you're on the highway, you travel through so many jurisdictions that it's better to just call Highway Patrol directly. Maybe it's common sense, but it wasn't something that I'd thought about before. But ever since that day, I've always had the number for Highway Patrol on my phone, just in case I ever need to use it. In the end, nothing really happened, and I'm grateful for that, but I'm sure glad that my dad was there that day, because if he wasn't, I don't know what would have happened. This happened in 2016, and this is the first time that I've ever spoken publicly about it. I also can't confirm what it was definitely. I always try to squash paranormal experiences with science and logic and stuff, so I'll understand if you don't believe it. But I just can't explain this one. And based on the circumstances, I think it was a jinn or something else supernatural. And yes, I know it's possible that I did this to myself somehow, but why have I never done it before or again since? It's just really strange. So, I've been looking up a lot of videos on jinns and stuff lately, the Islamic term for genie or demon kind of, and it's primarily about military folks that have experienced things. And I've always been fascinated with these creatures, ever since I, unfortunately, think I encountered one. For context, I'm American and first became exposed to the concept of jinns after living abroad in Muslim societies. I'm non-Muslim and non-religious, for your interest, but I thought that I would add that. But the most profound exposure was when I first went to Kashmir. I was invited by a friend and was staying at her home. If you don't know the history of Kashmir, then you should probably know that it's the most militarized zone in the world and has had a lot of bloodshed over the years. As beautiful as it is, it's also just very eerie as a result. I don't really know how to describe it either, other than being very creepy at night with just lots of weird sounds. Outside the city and being in the Himalayas, there's lots of woodlands where the jinn supposedly prefer to live. Anyway, while staying with my friend, I noticed things would happen to me at night, like my legs or arms would randomly be pulled. I thought maybe I was just sort of jolting myself awake at first, but it happened multiple times each night and was really out of character for me. Then, one night, I felt like I'd been choked awake. I was really shocked and sort of confused by this one. And the next morning, I finally opened up to my friend and her sister about what I'd been experiencing. They told me that because I would sleep in only underwear and a t-shirt at night, it was hot weather at the time, I was possibly attracting a jinn or their house angel, Persinder or something like that. The house angel could be jolting me awake as a way to warn me about wearing pants, where I could then attract a jinn. Obviously, I was very skeptical, but I decided to wear the pants anyway, and the weird jolting, I must admit, it stopped. A few days later, we decided to visit a rural scenic area of Kashmir. My friend's cousin, my now husband, yes, I did meet him here and we fell in love, took us there. But when we entered, I just started to feel extremely ill. It's hard to describe, but I felt really lightheaded, like I couldn't breathe, and an overwhelming sense of dread or anxiety hit me. I honestly felt like crying, and I wanted to turn around. We chalked it up to the higher altitude, but I had been to other areas with an even higher altitude at this point in the previous days, and had always felt fine. After sitting at a restaurant for some time, though, I finally felt better and we went on exploring the mountains. So I was frolicking in the hills with my now husband and we were just kissing. The first no-no. A bit later I had to pee, so I found a bush and I did my thing. For those Muslims that might be hearing this, I know. Bear in mind, I didn't know anything about this stuff and my husband didn't think to warn me. Because, let me tell you, you should never pee outdoors, especially in areas like this, because it's very possible that you'll pee on them or their home or something, and then they get angry. So yeah, this is where things started to go downhill. I returned back to the UK, where I was studying at the time. A few days later, I remember feeling just absolutely horrible for some reason. I was vomiting and just feeling really hazy. I assumed at first that it was just jet lag and went to sleep, and I actually slept for like 11 hours, not even waking up to pee once. When I finally woke up the next day, I hopped in the shower and my body just started to burn, like really burn. I was really confused as well as to why my body was burning like this, so I quickly hopped out and I looked in the mirror, and they were really deep, sort of curved, some in threes, which I've heard is an ode to the devil, scratches all over my chest, my breast, and my stomach. And man, did they hurt, and were even a bit bloody as well. I later found out too, when my friend looked for me and took some pictures, that they were also all over my back and right above my butt. The one above my butt was one downward curve and then two small horizontal curves inside of it, and they were in this sort of awkward place where I honestly don't think that I could have done it to myself. But I also didn't even have the nails to make such deep and intense scratches. I'm a very light sleeper too, and I just don't know how I could have done that level of damage to myself. Anyway, I showed it to all my friends, and they were all deeply disturbed and believed too that there's just no way that I could have done it to myself. I immediately told my husband to be, and he told me to recite some verses from the Quran that protect you from these jinns. And it was believed that I picked up a jinn in the place that we were at, and that it attached itself to one of the items that I brought from there. And, interestingly enough, reading from the Quran seemed to stop further activity. Now, I've been to Kashmir many times since and refused to return to that place. Also, the scratches have never happened again. Of course, I sometimes scratch myself, but they're always very minimal and nothing like that. I even tried to recreate the curved scratches at one point, and I just couldn't. And so, to be completely honest with you guys, I still have no idea how all those scratches got there. So this story didn't happen to me, but I heard it many times when I was growing up. My grandparents owned 80 acres about 20 miles east of Snowflake, Arizona. They had moved to the land in the early 80s after my grandfather had retired from the mine. The land was pretty barren, and I really don't know why they chose to buy it. Red sandstone bluffs and dry washes cut across the landscape, dotted with juniper and cedar trees, and just pretty much red sand everywhere. I suppose at the time that the land was cheap. They didn't have close neighbours, though. The closest was about a mile away, which was my aunt and uncle. The next closest neighbour was a man named Stoddard. I never got his first name, just Stoddard. He lived about 4 miles away from my grandparents at the base of one of the sandstone bluffs, apparently. He was just a terrible rancher, from what my grandparents said. He thought that he owned everything and was entitled to do whatever he wanted. More than once, my grandpa had caught him cutting my grandfather's barbed wire fence to let his cattle into my grandpa's land to graze. But anyway, long story short, this guy was just a jerk. Now, this area is actually full of ancient Anasazi ruins. Most of them have been destroyed by ranchers with backhoes trying to find pots to sell and whatnot. I'm sure Stoddard was one of them, in fact. But the story goes that one day after losing a calf, Stoddard stumbled upon a cave sealed by a giant slab of sandstone against one of the sides of the bluff. Curious about it, he used a backhoe to remove the boulder. After going inside, he discovers a burial cave, and I'm sure that he was delighted. He starts taking things from the burial cave and selling them. And well, from that moment on, he just had some really terrible luck. First, he lost about $500,000 in the stock market. Then his cattle all got diseased and died. He was pretty much in financial ruin, and he gets another blow. His wife gets diagnosed with an extremely rare disease and dies. Then Stoddard gets thrown from his horse and loses his ability to walk. This all happens within a couple of years, mind you. He tells everyone that he knows that he's cursed from the burial ground. They all laugh it off, but Stoddard puts all the artifacts back that he still has, and seals the cave back up with the boulder. And then he simply abandons all his belongings and just up and leaves one night. This is in the late 1980s, but fast forward a couple of years since Stoddard abandoned his ranch house. The land and the house are bought by a man from California. He puts the ranch house up for rent. My aunt is pregnant with her first son and decides to move up to Snowflake to be closer to her parents. Stoddard's house is actually fully furnished still, and so my aunt and her husband move in. He finds a job working nights at the local paper mill, and at first it seems like a nice little place. Creepy at night, admittedly, but not too bad. But then, weird stuff starts happening. For instance, my aunt starts hearing faint chanting and drums at night. She brushes it off. She had a hippie neighbor that lived about a mile away up on the bluff, so she figures that it must be one of them doing, well, hippie stuff. But she just can't help but feel like someone or something is always watching her all the time. She starts having terrible nightmares every night, but chalks it up to being alone and hormones and whatnot. She finally tells my grandpa about it, and he loans her his dog to keep her company at night. She drives the dog out there, but he just refuses to get out of the truck. The hair on his back is straight up, and he's growling now. She gets freaked out, but figures that maybe he saw a rabbit or something and hauls him into the house. The dog just stares at the door all night and growls. That night too, he growls and barks pretty much all night, all throughout the house. The drums and the chanting are louder this time. And the next morning, my aunt finds human bare footprints around the house. This goes on for about a week too, and the dog barks and growls at night, nightmares when she goes to sleep, footprints in the morning. The chanting and the drums keep getting louder, and finally, feeling like she's losing her mind, she asks my grandma to come over and stay the night with her. Grandma is more than happy to do this. After finishing her chores, she heads over, planning to make my aunt a nice meal. This is late in the afternoon. My aunt lays down for a nap, comfortable now that my grandma is there. My grandma decides to take a little walk at the base of the bluff. My grandma was actually a very religious person. She was very active in the church and devoted her life to Jesus. As she was out on her little walk, she likes to look for pottery shards or arrowheads and stuff like that. A little ways from the house, she gets a very unnerving feeling that something is watching her, though. She said that it made her skin crawl, and she could sense something evil. So my grandma prays and walks back to the house, pleading the blood of Christ. She decides not to say anything to my aunt, who is awake, because she's already pretty frightened. But she tells my aunt that maybe it's a better idea to stay at Grandma's house tonight. My aunt eventually agrees. By the time my aunt gets her stuff together, though, the sun is about to go down behind the bluff. Grandma, aunt, and dog all load up in the pickup. Grandma turns the key and nothing. She tries again. Nothing. Not being very mechanically inclined, Grandma goes into the house to call Grandpa, but he doesn't answer. She remembers that he was going into town this afternoon, and dang. So they unload and go back into the house, waiting for Grandpa to get home. It's nighttime now, no moon, pitch dark. The dog begins its low growl again. The sounds of chanting and drums begin, faint at first but growing louder. My grandma begins to pray in between calling Grandpa. But remember too that this is a time way before cell phones. And all of a sudden they hear something howl outside. Not a coyote howl, but something more ominous and large. And something is moving just beyond the reach of the porch light. Both women are beyond terrified at this point. And finally, after turbo dialing Grandpa so many times, he answers. My grandma is absolutely frantic at this point and says, "Elvin, something is outside of the house. You need to get here now." For what seems like hours, though, they wait for Grandpa's truck to come over the hill. Finally, they see the headlights. But before Grandpa flies into the driveway, something runs across the road in front of him. His headlights illuminate an animal, something. Grandpa jumps out of the truck yelling for the women to get the hell in. He unloads a couple of shots in the general vicinity of this animal. They haul ass down the dirt road towards Grandma's house. And my aunt, against her better judgment, looks back and she says that she sees red eyes watching them. The next day, too, my grandpa and uncle head over to the house. Grandpa verified that all around the house there were bare footprints in the sand, along with some really large coyote tracks. Needless to say, my aunt and grandma never went back to that house. My aunt won't even talk about it, in fact. I made the mistake of staying up too late one night and listening to the adults talk. My aunt actually moved in with my grandparents, but my grandma swears, though, that she would from time to time see those red eyes at night, just stalking the edge of her property. As far as I know, other people have tried living in Stoddard's house, but leave within a month or two. That whole area just seems to be cursed or something. I've always hated going out there too, because it has just a sort of an oppressive evil feeling to it, even at my grandparents too. I have more stories about this place involving other family members, but that'll have to wait for another time, because this is all I can muster up for now. But after researching and talking to some of my Native American friends, I'm fairly certain that my family members had the misfortune of running into a skinwalker. According to the Native Americans in the area, they frequent burials and graveyards, allegedly, looting and desecrating the sites. They take pieces of the brains and the bodies and grind them into a corpse powder or something to use in their curses. They also are known to terrorize people away from areas like burials and ruins, which is apparently why they think that it's a skinwalker. So this encounter took place approximately 10 years ago. I was 15 and pretty much on top of the world. Like others feel around this age too, I was absolutely invincible. At 15, I was a pretty big kid. I was about 6 foot and 200 pounds of strong and stupid. You'd think that I'd be a pretty terrible target, right? Well, this man didn't agree. So I was from a suburban area where my part of town was divided into a grid, approximately 8 blocks long and 8 blocks wide. Me and my friend Jesse were walking home from another friend's house who lives on almost the exact opposite corner of the development from me. We were on the way home and, as usual, I walked him to his house and then I walked to mine. We noticed a blue Ford Bronco was circling the blocks throughout our walk, but didn't really think much about it. When we got to his house and we hadn't seen the truck for a few blocks, I assumed I had nothing to worry about. out. I get another 2 blocks or so, and I see the truck again. He was parked on the side of the road, but you could hear that his truck was still running. He followed me all the way home, in fact, but was sure not to take the same exit route. I got to my front porch and could see that he was parked just a few houses down on the same side of the street. I mentioned it to my dad, an absolute mammoth of a man, and he went out to see the truck. He saw it and started walking down to it when it just took off. 2 weeks go by and I haven't seen the Bronco again. This walk home was almost a daily routine at this point. But we had a snow day from school and just me and my sister were home. I'm playing on the computer when something catches my eye. Directly to my right is a window and there's a man standing in it. Now, this window was on the first floor, but still approximately 5.5 feet off the ground, bi-level house. This man's entire head and body still fill the window, and he's got curly hair, a full beard, and looks to be pretty fat as he fills almost the whole window. We locked eyes, and I ran out the front to confront him. Again, more brawn than brain, kinda still true to this day in fact. But he ran off down the street to the same blue Bronco parked in almost the same spot as the last time. He pulled off faster than I could catch him, and this time, I called the cops. I gave them as much information as I could, and basically all they said was that they'd keep an eye out for him, and that's all they could do. I showed them where he was, and they were able to confirm it by the footprints in the snow leading to and away from the window. Now, what had made me a bit concerned, though, was I wore a size 12 shoe. My dad, who was still significantly larger than me at this point, wore a 14, and his shoes were still a bit smaller than the imprints in the snow. A few weeks go by, and there hasn't been any more weird encounters. My head's been on a swivel every time that I'm out of the house, though, I'll admit. I don't want to say that I was looking for a problem at this point, but quite honestly, I was. I was kind of hoping that this dude would show up and try something. I thought that I was ready for it. I wasn't, though. Me and Jesse were walking home from the same friend's house one night, and we saw this Bronco again. And screw it, I thought. We're 2 young, fit, and stupid dudes, so we figured that we're going to go and trap him. We went completely out of our way to go to the only dead end in the development to try and get him once we confirmed that he was following us. You'd never know it was a dead end too unless you knew the area, because there were never, and still aren't, any dead ends or no outlet signs. I guess that he had no idea what we were doing too, because he knew where we both lived, and he didn't follow us down. We thought that it was a perfect plan because of how many moves that he would have to make to turn around. Several cars were parked in the street, and it's not a cul-de-sac, just a road with no outlet. We thought that we could run up on him when he tried to back out, but he outsmarted us that day, I'll admit. The next day on the same trip, from the same friend's house on the same road, we see him again. I walk my friend home, and I figure, screw it. I'm fine, and I dare this dude to come out to me, and he didn't. This happened several more times over the next week or two until the guy decided to make his move. So I was on my way home after just leaving Jesse at his house. I got another block before I saw the truck, and I'm walking perpendicular to his truck when, as soon as I'm in his path, he turns on his lights. At this point, I ran up the few blocks to my house and waited on the porch to see where he was and what he was doing. This time, he stayed put, just a few houses down. I told my dad again, and he went out to see. The truck's still there, and so me and my dad start walking down to the truck. It's still not moving. This ballsy guy has the audacity to get out of his truck to confront us too. Terrible idea, I thought. He gets out when my dad is still 25 feet from the truck, and this guy is absolutely enormous. I guess my dad is about 6'4", right under 300 pounds, with a body built like Bud Light and Manor Labour. He's a solid, don't mess with that dude, but this guy still had size on him. But what I saw next was one of the most impressive things that I've ever seen in my life. So my dad's not much of a talker, and at this point he's already got a problem with this guy. The guy gets out of his truck with the most sadistic smile on his face, and my first thought was that this guy, he must have a gun. I yelled to my dad that he might have one, and all he yelled back was, "I got this." And well, long story short, he definitely had it. They walked up to each other, and before a word was even said, my dad just swung. Now, you can tell when somebody is out after they've been hit, and this dude, he was completely gone. Before he even started to crumble, my dad hit him again. He hit his truck and then he hit the ground. And I can tell you that whoever said that the bigger they are, the harder they fall, was absolutely correct. I never did see the guy again after this, and after just moving back into my parents' old house with my young son, I really hope that I never do. The cops were called too, but by the time that they got there, this guy was gone, which means that, unfortunately, he was never caught. So a little bit of context to help this story flow. My parents got divorced when I was 10, female, years old, and my brother was 8. They had bought a house in a fairly big land and decided to split it. The house was demolished and my mum was building a new house to live with me and my brother. But we lived in a very small city that is known for its safety. But fast forward to when I was 15, now I'm 25, and the house still wasn't really ready. Me and my brother and my mum lived in an apartment really close to where they were building the house, so we would check it out from time to time. It was an evening when me and my mum were getting back from the market and decided to go check the house. But as we were parking in front of the house, the car lights shone on a man trying to jump the fences to get in. Obviously, I was really freaked out, but my mum stepped out of the car and shouted to the man, "Oh, what the heck are you trying to do?" It was an old guy, maybe in his late 60s. He was really tall, white and skinny. He was starting to bald, having hair just on the sides of his head. He had some really creepy vibes about him too, but he jumped over the fence and looked kind of scared. He wasn't expecting someone to show up, I suppose, because nobody lived in that place yet. He said that he lived in the apartment building next to the house and he was trying to cut down a branch from a tree that was knocking on his window. So my mum said that he was trespassing and if he wanted to do something in her house that he should have contacted her. She yelled at him to get out of here and never come back, and he went home and never really talked about it. A few months later, my family finally moved into that house. It's a cute house with lots of trees and space for my dogs to run free. At that time, we had 3 dogs, 2 small ones and a border collie that we rescued. Every day, we could hear a teenager female voice yelling at the apartment building next to our house. We eventually figured out that it was just some teenage drama because we could hear them saying things that every teen had said to their parents, like, "I don't want to live here," or "You don't get me at all." So we didn't think anything about it, to be honest. Some time had passed, though, and my best friend moved to an apartment in that building. She said that she could hear the teen yelling at her father. And yep, guess who that father was? The man that was trying to get inside of my yard. That admittedly freaked me out a little bit, but I didn't have any proof that he was doing something to her. One evening, though, I was eating some fruit in the front of my house with my dogs, and I heard some screams, like a man and a woman were fighting. I looked around and figured out that it was coming from the building next to my house, and as I looked to the building, I saw a woman falling from a balcony, but couldn't see if anyone had pushed her. So I quickly called an ambulance, and they were really fast at getting here and taking her to the hospital. At the same time, the police came and took a man that I couldn't get a good look to see if it was the same man that trespassed here. And I didn't really figure out what happened that day and who that man was. My dad eventually started building his house next to my mum's. I spent a lot of time in my best friend's apartment that was just by the creepy man's apartment. But as I said, my yard was filled with trees, and sometimes we could see animals there, like lizards, snakes, foxes, possums. This day, though, me and my friend were in a balcony and could see a lizard walking on the wall that separated my house and the building. As we were watching this lizard, though, in the balcony next to hers, that creepy man showed up, with a gun no less, and tried to shoot that lizard. We started screaming at him like, "What are you doing, and why are you killing that lizard? Stop!" He looked at us surprised. I guess that he thought that he was alone. He didn't say anything, though, and just went back into his apartment. I told my dad about it, and he said that I shouldn't interact with that man. I was 18 at this point, and things started to calm down, or so I thought. It was an afternoon around 4 o'clock, and I was home alone. I decided to go for a walk with my border collie dog. She's really sweet, and I used to ride my bike as she followed me running, so that's what I was doing. As we were coming back to my house, just passing by the building, that same man throws a really big rock at my dog. She was running, so the rock hit her leg. I cursed at him to get back into his house, looking at my dog to see if she was hurt. I told my mum, and she said that I shouldn't walk past that house ever again. Some days later, I actually found a really cute but skinny cat at my college. I was sitting down smoking, and this cat jumped into my lap. I came back to watch a class with him in my lap, and he slept through the whole class, and I came back home with him. He was orange and sort of fierce, as he was a bit of a street cat before, and we let him go for walks in my street and whatnot. Pretty much everyone liked him. He was really friendly and asked for everyone to pet him. People even ended up letting him in their houses and frequently sent my mum pics of the cat in the yards or on the sofas and whatnot. So we never thought that he was really bothering anyone by walking around. At this point, though, we had totally forgot about the violent nature from our neighbour. And at one point, my family went on a trip to visit my grandma, and my dad stayed to take care of the pets. And he said that one night in particular, he heard some footsteps around his house, but as he walked out of the front door, he couldn't see anyone. He thought that it was just the dogs messing around, and eventually he went back into his house to get some sleep. But when we came back, we realized that one of the trees in my mum's backyard was actually dying. It was a really big tree too, and we think it's like 100 years old at least. This tree is the biggest one in the yard, and it was always just so beautiful, so it was really disappointing to see it in this sort of state. I should mention too that this is the tree that the man was complaining about the first time that we met him. So my dad went to look at the tree and figured out that it actually had a lot of sort of holes in it. He said too that this was actually a common way to get poison inside the tree to kill it. He also said that we probably shouldn't tell my mum because it was likely to scare her and make her really sad because the trees were the main reason that she bought that place. And in the end, I just never really told her about it. Some time passes though, and me and my brother moved out to another town to finish our studies. I wanted to take my cat with me, but my mum said that it was going to be hard for him to adapt living in the apartment. He liked walking around the neighborhood so much and visiting other people that, in the end, I just sort of agreed that she should stay with him. A few days later, she visited me and said that, unfortunately, my cat had actually died. I was broken. I mean, how did this happen? Allegedly, she found his neck broken in front of the apartment building next to our house, and his head was just completely twisted. But my cat was allegedly still alive at this point. As she arrived at the vet, though, she unfortunately passed away. She said that she thinks it was that man that killed him. We don't have any proof, but you know that feeling when you just sort of know it? Well, I cried a lot that night, and just writing about it makes me feel teary again. He was my first cat, and he was a really sweet boy, and it's just really unfortunate that he went that way. My mum still lives in the same house. She actually has 5 cats now, but none of them are allowed out. That man still lives next door to her as well, and I'm with her during quarantine, and I see him all the time. And you know, lately he's been walking past our house a lot, and also trying to look inside maybe to see if somebody's in there. I don't know what this guy's problem is, and I don't know if it's actually him who's done all these things because, well, we haven't been able to prove it, but like I said, I feel like it is him. We did install some cameras and even hired a security system, but nothing has come of it. But we're sort of at a loss for now, and I don't know. What do you guys think we should do? So due to the quarantine, my dad and I wanted to get out of the house and get the bikes rolling for a couple of days. Last Thursday, we locked up the house, packed up the saddlebags, fired up the bikes, him on a 58 Panhead and me on a Triumph, if anyone's interested. and rode up the Blue Ridge Parkway to the National Forest. Since all of the state park campgrounds are actually closed, we set up the tents in a little private campground by the river in a fairly remote place. Railroad tracks cut a path through the woods and it stretched into the distance. We passed through the nearest town hours ago. That night, after the fire was embered and my dad had retired, I was sitting by myself just texting some friends. My phone was running out of juice and I wanted to give my boyfriend a call before it died, so I walked to the other side of the clearing, staring into the darkness of the tree line. And it was then that I began to feel just a sense of unease, like I was being watched through the trees. I sat on a stump by the tracks and glanced down the rails, and then I caught sight of a dark silhouette against the starry night sky, and the moon reflecting off the slick tracks. I squinted, thinking that it was just the trees playing tricks on me, right? But then it moved, and that was when the dread hit me. Like when you're hiking through the woods and you spot a grizzly bear ambling across the trail or something. But it was a distinctly humanoid figure, with a thin torso and spindly limbs, no discernible facial features. It was about 30 yards away, crossing the tracks away from me. I stumbled back and quickly fell on my butt, but when I got up, it was just gone. I went back to the tent shortly after that, and I didn't sleep at all that night. Now, it may have been some sort of a dream or hallucination or mirage, but I don't know. I think that I definitely saw something. I've never been back to that place, and quite honestly, I don't know if I ever will, but it's something that I'll never forget. This story is from my days as a gas station clerk. I have tons of stories too, but most of them are just a little bit bizarre or sometimes even funny. There were a few eerie moments, but this was the only time that I was genuinely scared. So this happened during a football Saturday, so the store was full of people from the moment that I walked in. Most of the night it's a blur because it was just cashiering for the first 6 hours of my shift. But it was around 3 a.m. and things were finally starting to taper off. There were only a dozen or so people in the store left. I usually just kept my head down and focused on the transactions in front of me so I wouldn't get overwhelmed, only really looking up now and then to make sure that the store isn't on fire or something and nobody's stealing the wine case. I wasn't even looking around, to be honest, when I saw him. I just saw something strange in the corner of my eye at first and spun my head to look at him. When I got a good look, I was startled to say the least. Both of his eyes were completely red, like wet cherry tomatoes bulging out of his face. I've never seen anything like them since, too. His skin was almost translucent white, and he was soaking wet. His teeth were gritted, too, and looked way too big for his mouth. He was shaking as he fast-walked past the counter. I could hear the bathroom door slam from around the corner. I went back to my transaction and told myself that I needed to remember exactly where he was. I couldn't forget that he was in that bathroom, in other words. I rang out the next few people, watching for him the whole time. After about another 10 minutes or so, the store was suddenly empty. Customer rushes tend to be like that anyway, from 100 miles an hour to pretty much just nothing. But I knew that he was still in that bathroom. I actually thought about going to knock, but I sort of felt repelled. You can call me a coward if you want, but I know exactly how 5'6" doughy and totally alone I am where I'm at work. I had no intention of going near that door. But this is where things get stupid on my part. It's difficult to capture exactly what my thought process was. Partly it was paranoia, I'll admit. I was telling myself that maybe this guy had a gun or a knife and he might run out of the bathroom and murder me or something. That was definitely not going to happen, but the scariness outweighed the probability. On the other end of the spectrum, though, there's the part of me saying, you've worked this kind of job for like 2 years now, nothing bad ever happens. You're just making a big deal out of nothing. This honestly seemed fair. I mean, People have threatened to jump the counter before, to follow me home, or to wait until I get off work, and it never really happens. And I mean, if I genuinely believed that bad things would happen, I wouldn't be willing to work minimum wage to spend all night alone here. I look at the clock, and it's nearing 4 a.m., which is when I need to start brewing coffee for it to be ready when my manager comes in. The coffee grounds are all in the supply closet behind the counter, so I tell myself that it's totally fine to go and get them. It satisfies both my paranoia and my arrogance as well. I'm still doing my job, but doing something that I believe to be tactically the best move. If for whatever reason the guy opened the bathroom door and tried to run behind the counter and murder me, I could shut the door quickly and lock it from the inside. Besides, the bathroom doors are old and loud. I can easily hear them open from inside the closet, so I can just come out and wait near the panic button until he leaves. This all seemed like a pretty good idea to me at the time. So I decided to go get the coffee packets, and I'm listening carefully while I load up all the flavors I need. I figure that I'll only be a minute, so I don't even turn the lights on. I'm listening carefully, and I don't hear anything. I still don't hear anything. But then I hear a really weird noise. It sounds sort of like the water pipes in the back hissing at first, but it's too ragged, if that's the right word. I suddenly realize that the noise is breathing, and it's getting louder. Then it's right on top of me. Oh crap, I tell myself. I need to get out of this closet right now. That's when I stood and turned to leave, and saw him in the doorframe. In that moment, all I really remember thinking to myself was, oh my goodness, I am so stupid. I'm going to die, and it's going to be all my fault. Later, when my manager reviewed the footage, she saw him leaving the bathroom by slowly pushing the door open. Without making a sound, he had wandered behind the counter and peeked into her office, stepping in far enough to trigger the automatic light. After that, he had wandered behind the food service counter before making his way to the open supply closet door. The next thing that she saw on the camera was me absolutely flipping out. I stepped backwards, my body completely shaking so hard that my knees almost buckled. At this point, I think he realized just how absolutely horrifying this entire scenario was for me. He put up his hands and started apologizing awkwardly. He was really twitchy though, still gritting his teeth, and his eyes were still bright red. I basically went onto autopilot for a moment and said that I wasn't about to talk to him until he got out from behind the counter area. He walked backwards until he was barely on the other side of the employees-only entrance, standing next to the soda machine. He began asking for an iPhone charger, telling me that he was lost. He said that he had no money and just needed to charge his phone here until he could call for help. I told him that I don't have an iPhone charger and I couldn't help him. He sighed and looked down for a moment, seeming to think about what to do. Then he flipped his head back and screamed as loud as he could, the F word just over and over again, and punched the soda machine so hard. I backed up instantly and ran around the counter, up to where the panic button was under the register. I watched him as he walked around the store, punching the walls and kicking the counters and just screaming at the top of his lungs. I heard myself shouting over and over, "Get out, I'm calling 911. After a second, he stopped and turned around to look at me. He quietly apologized before just wandering out of the store and running off into the dark. At this point, I was shaking, but I tried to pick up and keep working. I started brewing the coffee, checking the windows to see if he was out in the parking lot, but I couldn't see him. After another few minutes, a regular came in and told me a strange man had come up to him asking for a ride. He said the guy was soaked and his eyes were bright red. And that was the moment when I decided to call the police. They actually found him in the parking lot next door, screaming and punching the moving trucks, apparently. They took him to sober up and calm down. They informed me that he was very sorry for losing his cool. He was just very drunk and very lost, allegedly. He had come from out of state for the game and got separated from his friends. Another regular assured me that I was an idiot for going into a small room with one exit, nowhere near a panic button when I thought that there might be a dangerous person in the store. I totally deserve that, I know. In the end, though, I was safe, but it did make me realize that something easily could have happened. I'm not as safe as I think I am, and, anyone could have come into the supply closet that night, so I guess that I'm glad that it was him and not somebody much, much worse. This was about 8 years ago now, and I was living with my mum and stepdad in Devon, England, after getting really sick a year before and having to move in with them to be looked after. I was about 22 or 23 years old at the time. My mum had moved into the house about 3 years earlier, and my stepdad, who was already with my mum, had moved in about 8 years earlier. Now, I never really liked this house. It was what we would say is a new-built house in the UK, and is on a large development site that has about 100 houses, which are all built in the same 5 designs over and over again. The house is a detached house with a dead-end road outside, and then beyond that, a green strip of trees and bushes before an iron railing fence, and then another road. It's a really quiet area. There is the occasional car, but not constant traffic noise, which I'm actually more used to having grown up in a city in Wales. As I have said, I never liked the house though. There were 3 doors into the house: the front door, the side door, and French doors out of the conservatory. There was also a garage that was built into the house and had an entrance to the house near the kitchen. My mum has actually had this remodeled recently, and it's bricked over into an office room. And I just never really liked how many doors were going into the house. My stepdad travels a lot for work, and my mum sometimes goes with him. I like them going away for a few days because I had the house to myself with just the cat, and I got some independence, which I missed after getting sick, but I never slept well when I was on my own in the house. Instead, I would just sort of stay up late in the night and catnap with the light on in the hallway, and my bedroom door open so that I could open my eyes and look straight at the top of the stairs. Now, one night they were away, and it was about 2 a.m, and I was sitting on the sofa in the living room with my laptop and only one lamp on right behind me. Every door was locked, and I double-checked them twice before I was comfortable in closing the curtains, which are really heavy and don't let light in or out, so I'm pretty sure that no one could see the light that was on behind me as the living room door was mostly closed. I was stretched out on the sofa with my laptop on my lap, and at my feet the cat was asleep. I'm not really sure what I was doing on my laptop. Maybe studying, or more likely scrolling through Tumblr or something, but as I sat there, the cat stirred and lifted her head, tilting it towards the front door. I couldn't really see the front door from where I was sitting because of the living room door being pushed, and to be honest, when the cat woke up at first, I wasn't really paying attention. She's quite a timid cat who gets startled at pretty much nothing, or maybe seeing something, I don't know, but the cat stirred properly, still looking intently at the living room door still, and as I finally paid attention to her, I noticed that the hallway beyond the door was lit up by the porch security light through the glass window in the front door. I was wary, but not overly worried straight away because I had noticed that the light comes on when foxes run past the house before. I got up and moved towards the living room door, but before I opened it, I could hear the handle of the door being very slowly pulled down. It was an old wooden door sort of thing, rather than the PVC doors you get usually. It was a pretty basic lock, and I had locked the door, removed the key earlier, and put across these really flimsy bolts at the top and bottom across. But I could hear the handle definitely being really slowly pulled down because it squeaked slightly, and then the barest rattle of the door happened, and at that moment, I was terrified. I picked up my mobile from the coffee table really quick and preloaded 999 into it. That's like 911 here, so I just had to press call if need be before opening the living room door. The porch light was still on, and through the glass, which was frosted, I could now see the outline of a man standing to one side of the door, and the handle was pressed all the way down. I sort of just froze for a second, and I had no idea how to react. The handle was obviously not opening the door, but he wasn't letting go, and I could see the door move very slightly as he seemed to push against the door. I finally shouted out something along the lines of, "Oi, what do you think you're doing?" And the handle snapped back quickly, and I stepped into the hall so that he could see me through the glass like I could see him through it. There was a pause of what felt like the longest 5 seconds of my life of us just sort of looking at each other, and then the outline ran back up the driveway, and it was too dark to see where he went. Obviously, I didn't sleep that night at all, and kept going around, making sure the doors were all still locked. When my mum and stepdad came home the next day, and I explained what had happened to my mum, she thought that maybe it had been some drunk coming home from the pub and getting the wrong house or something, and she told me not to worry about it too much. A few years later, after I moved back to Wales and my mum stayed alone in the house when my stepdad went away again, she was lying in bed on her laptop with the cat, same cat mind you, lying at the top of the stairs at about 1 a.m. My mum had her bedside light on, but no other lights in the house on, and as she watched, the cat stirred suddenly and looked down the stairs directly at the door. My mum got up to see what she was looking at, and looking down to the front door, she could see through the glass someone trying to handle again. She slapped the lights on as quickly as she could and yelled down at them. Whoever it was also scampered away. Now, I'm really not sure if the two instances are linked at all, considering the time frame between them, but if the person or people who keep trying to enter my parents' house could just please go away and leave us alone, that would be great. My skin still crawls just thinking about this guy even. He saw me shopping for school supplies and things for my new apartment one evening during my first week of grad school, and apparently decided that I was his mark. So I just moved to my new college town, didn't even have a cell phone yet after leaving the one my folks paid for during undergrad behind. I was grown and could take care of myself though. Eye roll, right? What a nitwit I was. As I left the parking lot with my purchases, though, I noticed this truck pull up behind me at the exit. It was late, and there weren't too many people out. I pulled out, and so did he. It was a few miles down a long retail street with lots of stoplights before my turn. As I drove, I realized the guy in the truck was trying to get my attention. I was in a relationship, so I just ignored him, thinking that he was trying to hit on me or something. Over the next few miles, he kept trying to get me to look at him. Some red lights, he would end up sort of ahead of me, some behind or beside me. At every light, though, he sort of positioned himself so that he could stare at me, either directly or in one of his mirrors. His gaze was unwavering, and my anxiety really rose because of that. He was driving sort of oddly, too, speeding up close to my bumper, that is, hitting his brakes when he was right in front of me, swerving close to my car a couple of times even. Finally, at a red light where he was beside me, I glanced over and absolutely started to panic when I was met with an unbelievably empty, unwavering stare and realized that he was actually, fiddling with himself. He was getting off on the fact that I was terrified, and he was following me, and he was trying to force me to pull over. At one point, I scooted through an intersection on a hard yellow, a couple of cars ahead of him, thinking that I could shake him. Nope. He went around those cars at the light and ran the red to get back in front of me. A freeway entrance ramp was coming up, and I tried to fake him out by putting on my signal and getting into the merge lane for it. He took the bait and started up the ramp. I quickly got out of the merge lane and continued straight. Again, I hoped that I could lose him, but he drove his truck down the embankment to keep following. At another light, where he was beside me, I pulled through the light and then turned to the last possible second, but he made a U-turn and ran another red to follow me. My panic really ramped up at that point. With no cell phone, no sense of direction in a new city, I really didn't know what to do. So I just sort of turned on classic rock and forced myself to sing along and forced myself to go the speed limit so I wouldn't crash out of terrified stupidity. I also decided to drive to the supermarket across town because I remembered it had a police station in it. And he followed me all the way there. Thankfully, though, he burned out of the lot as soon as he saw all the cop cruisers parked out front. I filed a report and asked for a police escort home. I insisted for this too because, I don't know, something told me that this creep was waiting for me to leave the police station. And he was. As soon as I pulled out, I saw him. I pulled over and I told the officer following me, and he went after him, but the truck had taken off and the cop couldn't catch him. But thankfully, the police got the surveillance video from the first store. And it turned out that this jerk had been dogging me the entire time that I was shopping. I saw him on surveillance footage just following me through the store. I saw him follow me out, close enough in fact to grab my elbow. I saw footage of him circling the lot in his truck, waiting for me to pull out when I took too long to unload my cart. And, quite frankly, my heart sank. I was able to remember 6 of the 7 digits of his plate and the make and model of his truck. In the end, though, the cops did basically nothing. They said it was a he said, she said sort of situation, since the surveillance video didn't actually catch him doing anything particularly unlawful, and was a losing case to try and charge him with anything. I ended up trading vehicles with a friend for a couple of months to try to feel safer, and I went on with my life. I had no idea what this disgusting human did just a handful of months later, until almost 15 years had passed. So I was watching a Discovery ID show about the kidnapping and murder of Sandy Jeffers. I almost fell out of my seat when I saw the mugshot of her killer, Aaron Lee Skeen, because it was him, no doubt in my mind. I was also just so disgusted that law enforcement did nothing in my case that I tracked down the investigator in the murder case for, and after verifying some things about his vehicle that were changed in the TV reenactment to weed out people making crap up, she took my contact info finally and an official statement. She could neither confirm nor deny that my run-in was with Skeen, but qualified her statement by saying, "At least you don't have to worry about him anymore because he got life without parole." I only wish that something would have been done when he terrorized me, and I don't know, perhaps things would have been different for Sandy. My unit in the US Army was deployed to Iraq in April of 2006. We were in Ramadi. It was 123 kilometers, 77 miles out of Baghdad. I was in my Humvee, headed to Baghdad for emergency leave due to a death in my family. It was close to midnight. The Humvee that I was in had 3 others and a turret gunner. The 2 other Humvees had the same 5 total people, 1 in front, 1 in back. I was without a weapon due to my leave. The Humvee in front stopped hard, and we all figured that it was a possible IED or VB IED. The team leader in our HV radioed the lead HV, and the convo went something like this. "Hey, what's up? Why did you stop? Hey, something flew in front of the HV." "What? Flew in front of the HV?" "Yeah." "Well, we didn't see anything." And the third HV piped in with, "Hey, does anyone hear that hello?" Yeah, but I don't see it. Did the other 2 vehicles?" And just then in the desert off the highway was a black figure, and it looked like a huge bird. It looked like maybe smoke was emitting from it. A blackish, greenish smoke with a bit of a blue tinge. We all focused our eyes. The 2 troops with better nods, night vision, could see something, but couldn't make out what it was. The smoke was apparently distorting the view. And within a second or 2, a rock was thrown at one of the Humvees. A big rock too, like the size of somebody's head. We used a spotlight, and in that light, something just flew straight up, and it was loud. And then we heard what I can only describe as a loud screeching noise. Within a minute, it was over, but We all just sort of sat there in a state of shock, curiosity, and panic. And I mean, what the heck was that? When we got back to Baghdad, the translator that we were picking up to bring to the Marines, he was there with us. And he said that it sounded like we encountered an Ifrit. A team leader said, "A what?" And he said, "An Ifrit, a winged jinn." We were all a bit speechless. We chose not to disclose to our command the winged thing and instead just described it as battle fatigue. It was well known that PTSD was a career killer at this juncture. It's been 13 years since this happened. I met my now husband in 2015, and he'd also been deployed to Ramadi with my sister unit at the time, and he had went through this particular stretch of the highway on his mid-deployment leave. He recounted a similar story to me, and it was enough to stop me in my tracks. It was actually pretty close to mine, except they didn't stop, they just sort of boogied on through. Considering the time we were there for was pretty deadly, including an aid station manned by soldiers that was ambushed and blown to bits. I was a medic, so death was my norm at the time, but I still can't wrap my mind around it. And now, apparently the last 2 places I live in, something seems to have followed us. I might share those stories another time, but for now, I'll leave it here. So this happened to me about 5 years ago, during which I was working at an after-school music studio teaching private lessons. The building I worked in was an old walk-up, one of the oldest buildings in the town, in fact, and supposedly it was haunted, according to my boss anyway. Almost all of my co-workers had really strange experience late at night at that studio, while closing up or on their own and whatnot. I had some pretty strange experiences as well, hearing people fiddling around with a piano when there was no one in the room, hearing footsteps and people talking when I was the only one there, stuff like that. I've always been sensitive to these things, so it actually didn't freak me out that much. I just assumed that it was some spirit or energy that was still in the building, and I ignored it most of the time anyway. However, one night, I had just finished my last lesson of the evening and I was closing up. I was the last teacher there, and there was just something very eerie about the feeling in the building that night. I felt as if somebody was genuinely in the room with me and was watching my every move. I got my stuff and hustled out of the building as quickly as I could. But driving back home, I just couldn't shake the feeling that somebody was in the car with me. I had never felt that before, but I felt as if whatever it was in that building felt lonely or something, and maybe it attached itself to me. As usual, I took it off, and I tried not to think about it for the rest of the night. The next morning, my boyfriend had left for work early as usual, around 6 o'clock, and I got up later in the morning, 8:30, to get ready for my day. I step into the shower, and immediately I feel a person's presence just so strongly. This thought pops into my head that this person in here is watching me shower. I know that sounds insane, but I just felt it so intensely. So out loud, I decided to yell, "Please leave me alone." And immediately, I heard my front door slam. Not my bathroom door, but my front door. And then I no longer felt this person's presence. I finished my shower, dried off, and I decided to take a look at my front door entrance, and I saw the scariest thing that I think that I've ever seen in my life. 2 wet footprints right in front of that door. This really did happen, and I've tried to reason it away and find logical explanations, but nothing has made sense so far. I genuinely believe that this was a spirit, and it got a little bit too close for comfort, let's say, and decided to pop in the shower with me that morning. So my husband's dad is the VP of operations for a company that employs truck drivers for delivery. Anytime a driver hits brakes, speeds excessively, swerves, or anything like that, a camera automatically records just before to just after the incident. It's always on and running, but only records when an unsafe event occurs, and that footage is automatically uploaded and my father-in-law views it. There are 2 cameras. One of them records the driver and one faces the road. He basically determines whether disciplinary action needs to be taken if the driver is driving inappropriately. Now, my father-in-law received a video last spring, and I'm going to describe the events for you. 2 truck drivers were driving down a 2-lane road late at night, early morning. It's pitch black outside, but they see something ahead on the road. As they get closer, you can actually see a female in a white dress walking in their lane. The person turns around to look at them as they pass through or by them. But what the video doesn't show is that they stop and jump out because they don't believe there is any way that they didn't hit this girl. They don't see anyone in the road, no one is in the ditch, no blood or evidence of anyone was there in fact. They were still convinced though that they'd hit someone, so they called the police. The police showed up to write a police report and investigate, but found nothing upon searching the surrounding area. Some research was done into the area, and it actually turns out that in 2013, a girl was walking in the road there and was killed when struck by 2 vehicles. My father-in-law is not tech-savvy by any means, so he logged into his corporate account on my husband's laptop, and we helped him download the video. Unfortunately, for legal reasons, I'm not allowed to share the video, but I did take some screen grabs for you guys to look at. In the video, you can actually see that there are 2 cones that have the shoulder blocked off, which didn't allow them to swerve out of the way. You can see them approaching the woman who was walking in their lane. You can see their reactions before and after passing the lady, and the speed that they were traveling at too. I have the screen grabs of internal emails discussing the event, and the subject line is the ghost incident, but I 100% can't post those. But the entire incident has them in a tizzy, for a lack of a better term. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the pictures, and it's a weird one for sure.